November 20th, 1943, 5:42 a.m. off Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll. The sky is still charcoal gray when the first naval shells begin to fall. 16-inch guns from the battleships USS Maryland and USS Colorado thunder across the lagoon. The concussion rolls over the water like a physical thing, rattling ribs, shaking teeth. On the horizon, Betio is barely more than a black line against a faint Pacific dawn. But every Marine in the pitching landing craft knows what waits there: concrete bunkers, interlocking machine guns, and nearly 5,000 dug-in Japanese defenders under Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki. Inside one small plywood and steel boat, 36 Marines of the 2nd Marine Division grip rifles slick with salt spray. The ramp in front of them is shut tight. The coxswain squints through the smoke and rising light. The boat is an LCVP, landing craft vehicle personnel. Most of them just call it a Higgins boat. Andrew Higgins, a civilian boat builder from New Orleans, had designed it with a shallow draft and a flat bottom. It could run right up onto a beach and drop its front ramp so men could charge forward instead of climbing over the sides. To some Navy brass it looked crude, boxy, flimsy, too simple to survive real combat. They had laughed at it. Steel hull too thin, they said, too exposed, too vulnerable, it would splinter under fire. But this morning, there are no alternatives. Ahead of them lies a coral reef stretching hundreds of yards from shore. Planners believed high tide would give enough water depth for landing craft to glide over it. Intelligence briefings promised 3 to 5 feet of clearance. The tide never came. As the naval bombardment lifts, the Higgins boats surge forward in formation. Engines roar. The lagoon churns white with prop wash. Marines steady themselves as bullets begin snapping across the water. Then it happens. The first wave of heavier LCMs grinds to a halt. Propellers chew uselessly against coral. Hulls scrape and shudder. Boats that were supposed to carry tanks and heavier equipment sit stranded, hundreds of yards from the beach, stuck on a reef that was supposed to be underwater. And the Japanese machine guns begin to wake up. Tracers streak low and flat across the lagoon. You can almost hear the sound before you process it, the ripping canvas snarl of a Type 92 heavy machine gun. Mortar rounds arc from hidden pits and splash among stalled craft. Marines leap into chest-deep water, rifles held overhead, packs dragging them down. The lagoon turns red in places. But the Higgins boats keep moving. Their shallow draft, barely 2.5 feet, allows them to creep closer than the heavier craft. Not all the way, not perfectly, but closer, close enough to matter. Coxswain after coxswain guns the throttle, feeling the hull scrape coral beneath them. Some boats grind to a stop early. Others slide forward, improbably, almost delicately, over ridges that should stop them. The criticism that once surrounded the Higgins design suddenly feels distant, academic. Inside the boats, Marines crouch low as bullets crack against steel sides. The hull vibrates with impacts. Splinters of wood fly. One round punches through, striking a man in the shoulder. He slumps but stays upright. No one can move. 30 seconds feel like an hour. At 6:13 a.m., one Higgins boat reaches the reef's inner edge. The coxswain shoves the throttle forward one last time. The hull lurches, shudders, then grinds to a stop in waist-deep water. Drop it. The ramp crashes down. And the Pacific War changes forever. Marines spill forward into the surf, rifles high, faces tight with shock as they realize the bombardment has not silenced the island. Japanese bunkers, built from coconut logs and reinforced concrete, are intact. Fields of fire overlap perfectly. There is no cover. Men fall before they take 3 steps. But they are closer than expected. Close enough that a sprint, a crawl, a desperate lunge might reach the seawall. More Higgins boats grind forward behind them. The lagoon is chaos, stalled craft, sinking craft, men wadding under fire, yet the steady, stubborn advance of those shallow-draft boats continues. Each one that reaches the reef's inner edge shortens the killing distance by precious yards. What had been dismissed as flimsy is now the only thing bridging the gap between sea and sand. On the beach, Japanese gunners stare in disbelief as more Americans appear directly in front of them instead of floundering far out on the reef. The geometry of their defensive plan begins to fracture. And somewhere, far from Tarawa, the man who built these boats has no idea that his design is about to be baptized in the most brutal test imaginable. Because the real trial of the Higgins boat isn't surviving the approach. It's surviving what happens next. The first Marines hit the sand at 6:17 a.m. There is no dramatic charge, no sweeping advance, just men diving headlong into a wall of noise and sand. Betio Island is barely 2 miles long and a few hundred yards wide, a strip of coral and palm trees turned into a fortress. Admiral Shibazaki had boasted that 1,000,000 Americans couldn't take it in 100 years. His engineers had buried blockhouses into the sand, reinforced them with steel rails and coconut logs, and zeroed every approach with pre-sighted machine guns. Now those guns open fully. The sound is relentless. Type 92 heavy machine guns hammer from the flanks. 7.7 rounds whip low across the sand, inches above the ground, cutting down men who try to stand. Mortars thud from behind the airstrip. Shrapnel bursts above the surf, shredding exposed silhouettes. You can almost feel the heat of it. Not just the tropical sun rising fast over the lagoon, but the friction of bullets slicing through humid air. At the waterline, Marines stack up behind a low seawall made of coconut logs. It is barely 18 inches high. It might as well be a mountain. Second Lieutenant William Hawkins of the 2nd Marines crawls forward, flamethrower teams hugging the sand behind him. He shouts orders no one can hear. A sergeant drags a wounded man by his suspenders, leaving a dark smear behind them. Offshore, more Higgins boats approach. Coxswains lean forward over their wheels, eyes narrowed against smoke and spray. They are steering into a furnace. Bullets strike metal hulls with a sound like hammers on sheet iron. Some rounds punch through. Some ricochet wildly. One boat takes a direct mortar hit and vanishes in spray and debris. But others keep coming. The simplicity of the Higgins boat becomes its strength. No complex systems to fail. No deep keel to trap it. Its shallow draft allows it to nose closer than any other craft that morning. Even when it grounds, it often does so within sprinting distance. Ramp down. Men out. Again and again. Each landing is a roll of the dice. Some ramps drop into thigh-deep water, forcing Marines to wade under fire. Others land almost flush with sand, granting precious seconds of footing. Behind the first waves, LVT amphibious tractors, the Amtraks, grind forward on tracks, carrying reinforcements, but many of them are knocked out quickly. Their armor is thin. Flames lick upward from disabled vehicles near the shoreline. That leaves the Higgins boats. By mid-morning, the lagoon is littered with them. Some drift unmanned, others burn quietly. Yet dozens have already done their job, delivering men directly into the teeth of the defense. And those men begin to push. Hawkins leads a small team toward a Japanese bunker covering the pier. He moves in short bursts, throwing grenades, hugging craters. A flamethrower roars to life, liquid fire pouring into a firing slit. The bunker coughs smoke. The machine gun falls silent. It is one strongpoint among dozens. Every 50 yards feels like a mile. Every bunker is a miniature fortress. Japanese defenders fight with disciplined fury, emerging from tunnels to launch counterattacks, hurling grenades at point-blank range. But something has shifted. The planners had feared Marines would be forced to wade hundreds of yards from the reef. That slaughter would have been total. Instead, thanks to the shallow draft LCVPs, Enough men reached the beach in the first waves to establish a tenuous foothold. Fragile, bloody, but real. By noon, Colonel David Shoup, wounded in the leg and exposed on the beach, radios back a message that is almost painfully understated. Casualties many. Percentage of dead not known. Combat efficiency, we are winning. Winning? It doesn't look like winning. The sand is cratered and stained. Medical corpsmen work frantically behind the seawall. Water runs low. Ammunition is passed hand to hand. Bodies lie where they fell because no one can move them without drawing fire. Offshore, Navy officers watch through binoculars, stunned by the resistance. The pre-invasion bombardment had been shorter than planned, compressed by scheduling pressures. Many Japanese positions survived intact. But the Higgins boats continue their relentless shuttle. Back and forth, delivering ammunition, reinforcements, water cans, even evacuating wounded when they can edge close enough to load them. Each trip is a gamble against mortars and artillery. And slowly, yard by yard, the Marines claw inland. The airstrip at the center of Betio becomes the next objective, a flat, exposed killing ground. To reach it, they must cross open sand under enfilading fire. As afternoon shadows lengthen, you can sense it. The turning point isn't dramatic. It isn't cinematic. It is incremental. The beachhead, once measured in yards, begins to stretch. Not because the defenses were weak, but because enough men made it ashore alive. And that only happened because a boat once dismissed, as flimsy, refused to stop at the reef. Yet the battle is far from decided. Night is coming to Tarawa, and the Japanese are not finished. By 6:00 p.m., the sun sinks into a bruised Pacific horizon. Smoke hangs low over Betio Island, thick and oily. The air smells of cordite, saltwater, burning rubber, and something far worse. The tide has shifted slightly, but not enough to change the battlefield. Wrecked landing craft sit stranded on coral teeth. Some Higgins boats still drift in the lagoon, engines dead, hulls punctured and scarred. On the beach, the Marines dig in. There is barely anything to dig into. The island is coral sand over hard limestone. Entrenching tools scrape uselessly. So men build shallow foxholes with helmets and hands. They stack the dead as grim cover. They press themselves behind the same coconut log seawall that had been their only protection that morning. Colonel David Shoup moves among them despite his wounded leg, leaning on a makeshift crutch. His glasses are caked with grit. He studies the thin line they've carved, a few hundred yards deep at best. It feels impossibly fragile. Behind the American line, Japanese defenders prepare. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki has already been killed by naval shellfire earlier in the day, but his plan remains intact. Tunnels honeycomb the island. Reinforced bunkers dot the airstrip. Communication trenches connect strongpoints. As darkness falls, the defenders begin to shift silently through these passages. At 7:30 p.m., the first counterattack hits. A shrill cry rises from the darkness. Then the gunfire begins again. Japanese soldiers surge forward in small groups, rifles and bayonets flashing in the strobe of muzzle blasts. Some carry demolition charges strapped to their bodies. Others crawl close enough to throw grenades into shallow American positions. The Marines fire point-blank. Garand rifles crack in rapid rhythm. Bar gunners sweep the darkness in controlled bursts. Flares arc overhead, bathing the beach in ghostly white light before plunging it back into blackness. You can almost feel the confusion, friend and enemy only feet apart, voices shouting in two languages, the sudden impact of a body colliding in the dark. Hand-to-hand combat erupts in places along the line. Entrenching tools become weapons. Bayonets find targets by instinct rather than sight. But the line holds. Behind it, Higgins' boats still operate in the lagoon under cover of darkness. It seems almost impossible. Yet coxswains make cautious runs, guided by dim signals and shouted directions. They deliver ammunition and pull back wounded when they can find room to load them. Their engines are quieter now. The lagoon is eerily calm between bursts of fire. Earlier that year, some officers had questioned whether the LCVP could survive even daylight landings under heavy resistance. Now these same boats are creeping into a combat zone at night, their flat bottoms allowing them to edge close enough to matter. The flimsy hulls are dented and scarred, but they are still afloat. Just before midnight, a larger Japanese banzai charge slams into a sector held by the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. The attack is ferocious but uncoordinated. Marines, dug shallow and exhausted, unleash disciplined volleys. The sand in front of them becomes a dark, uneven carpet. By 3:00 a.m., the firing tapers off. The island grows strangely quiet. The Marines lie awake, rifles across their chests, staring into blackness. Some whisper, some pray, some simply listen to the distant lap of water against grounded boats. They have survived the first day. Barely. Dawn will bring the second. And with it, the realization that taking Tarawa will require something even harder than landing on it. Because now they must cross the airstrip. And the Higgins boats, battered but unbroken, will have to deliver more men into that widening inferno. November 21st, 1943, 7:10 a.m. The sun rises hard and merciless over Betio. In its light, the battlefield reveals itself fully for the first time. The lagoon is cluttered with wreckage, shattered LCVPs, burned-out Amtraks, bodies caught against coral heads. The tide has pulled some away. Others remain grotesquely still. On the beach, Marines blink against the glare and the reality of what they endured. Ahead of them lies the airstrip. A flat, open stretch of coral runway running nearly the length of the island's center. No trees, no dunes, no natural cover, just packed sand and crushed coral, perfectly measured by Japanese gunners during months of preparation. Colonel Shoup knows what crossing it will mean. But it has to be done. Reinforcements arrive at first light. More Higgins boats grind forward across the reef, carrying fresh Marines from the 6th Regiment. Their hulls are pitted with bullet scars from the previous day. Some bare makeshift patches hammered over holes, yet they come again. Ramp down. Men out. There is something almost mechanical about it now, a rhythm forged in blood. The Higgins boat has become less a vehicle and more a bridge, an extension of the shore itself. Offshore, destroyers move dangerously close to the reef line. USS Ringgold and USS Dashiell fire point-blank into visible bunkers, their 5-inch guns blasting coconut logs apart. Naval gunfire coordination improves, lessons learned in hours that should have been studied for years. At 9:00 a.m. the push begins. Marines rise from shallow scrapes and sprint. Across the airstrip. The first seconds are the worst. Japanese machine guns reopen from hidden flanking positions. Mortars walk steadily across the open ground. The sound is a constant tearing roar. Men fall mid-stride. But others keep moving. Second Lieutenant Alexander Bonneman Jr. leads an assault on a massive bomb-proof shelter dominating the center of the island. His platoon advances in short rushes, diving flat as bullets crack overhead. Flamethrowers hiss to life again, jets of fire licking into firing slits. Inside those bunkers are defenders who have sworn not to surrender. The fight becomes intimate. Grenades roll through doorways. Demolition charges collapse entrances. Smoke pours from shattered concrete. By noon, portions of the airstrip are in Marine hands. The island is not yet secured, far from it, but the defensive geometry has changed. Japanese strongpoints are now isolated from one another. Communication trenches are cut. Counterattacks grow smaller, more desperate. And through it all, the Higgins boats continue their relentless shuttle. They bring forward 37 anti-tank guns. They haul in ammunition crates and water cans. They evacuate the wounded men pale with blood loss, eyes glazed from shock. Some boats return with decks slick and silent. The coral reef that was meant to be a killing barrier has become a rough but navigable highway. Not perfect, not safe, but usable. That usability changes everything. Observers in the Navy and Marine Corps watch the unfolding battle with hard clarity. They see what worked and what almost failed catastrophically. They see how vital shallow draft landing craft are when tides miscalculate and reefs defy planning. By late afternoon, the Marines control most of the western half of Betio. But the eastern end still bristles with resistance. Japanese defenders fight from rubble and tunnels, emerging suddenly to fire and vanish again. Snipers remain active. Booby traps claim careless steps. The battle grinds forward in yards. On November 22nd, the final coordinated resistance collapses. A last desperate banzai charge surges into Marine lines before being annihilated. By November 23rd, organized defense ends. Tarawa is secured. It has taken 76 hours. And the cost is staggering. Over 1,000 Marines killed, more than 2,000 wounded. Nearly the entire Japanese garrison destroyed. The photographs shock America. Bodies on beaches, wrecked landing craft in shallow water, the price of amphibious assault laid bare for the public to see. But within the blood and chaos lies a brutal education. Because Tarawa did not just prove the courage of the Marines. It proved something else. That modern war would be decided at the water's edge. And the humble, once-mocked Higgins boat had just demonstrated it, was the only craft capable of carrying an army across that final, deadly distance. What happened at Betio would not stay at Betio. It would reshape every landing that followed. In the weeks after Tarawa, the lagoon goes quiet. Wrecked landing craft are dragged from the reef. Burned hulls are studied. Bullet holes are counted. Survivors are debriefed in detail that borders on obsession. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps do something rare in wartime. They admit what went wrong. And they learn from it. Reports circulate through Pearl Harbor and Washington. Tidal miscalculations, inadequate pre-landing bombardment, insufficient amphibious tractors, poor intelligence on reef depth. But one conclusion stands out with startling clarity. Without the shallow draft LCVP, the landing would have failed outright. The Higgins boat, simple, boxy, almost crude in profile, had delivered enough men close enough to shore to create a foothold. It had done so under direct machine gun fire, over jagged coral, through mortar splashes and burning wreckage. It had not been elegant. It had been essential. Andrew Higgins, back in New Orleans, receives word of Tarawa's cost. He reads about the reef, about the stalled heavy craft, about the Marines forced to wade, and about the boats that made it closer. He does not celebrate. He increases production. By 1944, Higgins Industries is operating around the clock. Thousands of workers, including women and black Americans hired in integrated production lines rare for the era, assemble LCVPs in staggering numbers. The output becomes almost industrial poetry. One boat every hour. Then faster. President Franklin D. Roosevelt would later say that Andrew Higgins was the man who won the war for us. It sounds like exaggeration. Until you look at Normandy. June 6, 1944, the English Channel. When the ramps drop at Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, they are Higgins ramps. When U.S. Army infantry leap into waist-deep surf under German MG-42 fire, they leap from LCVPs. When Rangers scale Point du Hoc. When British commandos storm Sword Beach. when Canadian troops push inland from Juneau. They arrive in boats born from the lessons of places like Tarawa. The improvements are visible: longer naval bombardments, underwater demolition teams clearing obstacles, better coordination between air, sea, and land, more armored support, more amphibious tractors. But at the center of it all remains the same shallow draft design. Flat bottom, steel ramp, forward assault. From the coral reefs of the Pacific to the hedgerows of France, the Higgins boat becomes the connective tissue of Allied strategy. It carries Americans onto Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. It carries British and Commonwealth troops into Sicily and southern France. Nearly 23,000 LCVPs are built by war's end. The laughter that once greeted Higgins' prototype vanishes completely. Because amphibious warfare, once considered a niche capability, becomes the defining method of Allied advance. Entire continents are re-entered from the sea. And it works because the last 100 yards, the most dangerous distance in modern war, can finally be crossed with speed and repetition. Tarawa had been the crucible. It proved that reefs could not be trusted, that bombardment could not be assumed sufficient, that defenders would fight to the last man, and that landing craft could not be ornamental. They had to be survivable, shallow, brutally functional. The Higgins boat was exactly that. If you stand on Betio today, the lagoon looks almost peaceful. The water is clear, deceptively shallow. Coral glints beneath the surface. It's hard to imagine that this quiet water once decided the future of amphibious warfare. But in November 1943, when heavier craft stalled and the reef threatened disaster, it was a so-called flimsy plywood boat that kept moving forward. Ramp down, men out, again and again. They laughed at it, until the day it carried an army through fire, and proved that wars could be won not just by grand strategy or massive battleships, but by the stubborn practicality of a design that refused to stop at the reef. And from that moment on, every beach in the world became vulnerable. And